With this, I would like to go to our next point on the agenda, and this is going more in depth into the problematics and into the solutions by 5 plenary talks, which come from industry, from knowledge institutions, and from NGOs. And since we are already a little bit over time, I would like to give the word right away to the moderator of that session, which is Jane Torning-Callison from SDU Tech Communication. Jane, are you on board? I think you are. I can see you.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm here and the board, and thanks for the great welcome addresses. So for the next 2.5 hours, we'll be listening to 5 plenary talks. We have some amazing speakers from all around the world, and there will be a short break after the first 2 presentations. So our first speaker this morning is Self Schultz, who is an executive director of the Resilience Shift, which is a global initiative to accelerate systemic resilience. Seth has a long track record of building consensus and initiating change in the field of sustainable development, and of raising international awareness on the role of cities in tackling climate change. He's also a passionate advocate for a safe, resilient, and sustainable future, and the role that the scientific, engineering, and technical communities can play in contributing to transformative and long-term resilience. He sits on various boards and advisory councils, and is a sought-after speaker and guest lecturer, and lives in New York. So with that short introduction, I'd like to give the word to Seth.
Thanks so much, Jane. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm just going to pull up my my presentation now. I believe I'll be running it from my side. Is that right? Yes, Jane?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Jane, can you see my screen now?
Yes, everything is perfect.
Oh, fantastic. Well,
just one comment, Seth. If you could choose swap displays, because we see the presenter side.
Let's see here.
In the top of your screen, press swap displays.
Oh yes, that's true.
So you see it in presenter mode right now?
Yes, yeah, we see the presenter mode.
And how about now?
1 second. I think you need to share the screen again. You unshared, and I think you need to share it again.
Sure.
No, still not. But if you can just do it in the mode you're in now. So if you take the top of your screen, you can choose swap displays. There's simply a button called swap displays.
Yep. Thanks. That was the problem.
And then share again.
How about now?
Yes, looks perfect.
Well, thanks again. Well, I'm delighted to be with you all, everybody today. I'm in New York, so it's 3:30 here in the morning. I don't know where else everybody is from, but it's actually a pleasure to be joining everybody today. And even given the time, I couldn't pass up an opportunity or an invitation from Project Zero to join you for this climate neutrality conference. I'm absolutely delighted. A quick thank you to the organizers and the sponsors for asking me to participate in the conference. But most importantly, I'm especially excited to speak to everybody who is also joining in from wherever you may be. I'm sure, as we heard from many of the opening remarks, that a lot of the people participating now in this conference have been working on issues of sustainability and resilience for many years. Or perhaps you have an interest or a concern or a desire which is motivating you to learn more and get involved. Either way, I'm sure you're aware of the need to act, but perhaps not clear on how much you need to do or how quickly. Well, the simple answer is a lot, but I think it may be even more than you could possibly imagine. You see, I'm increasingly worried that if we had all the political willpower, all the money that we need, and all the technology, we actually don't have enough time to accomplish the task ahead of us. I'll let that sink in for a moment. We are out of time. To accomplish the task at hand, we cannot apply the same set of rules, processes, standards, and methods if we are to succeed. If we accept that this decade of change is the most pivotal, and we look at what needs to happen over the next 10 years, then we must accept that radical collaboration, innovation, failure, and adaptability must be the tools in our toolkit. But first, let's take stock on where we are and how we got here to determine if we're making any progress. 12 years ago, when I started getting heavily involved in international climate change work, Denmark was hosting COP15 in Copenhagen. Now, for many, it was a memorable COP as it was believed to be the time when an international agreement would occur, but it did not. But why it was memorable for me is because there was a delegation of mayors that went to Copenhagen that year to be part of the discussions, and they were not allowed to participate. They were not part of the international climate community. They were merely non-state actors, as the UN refers to them, and not deemed very important. Now, in hindsight, it was a major inflection point. It was the beginning of the Think Global and Act Local movement in a way that honestly began by empowering mayors and cities all over the world in a very real way. Now, 12 years later, and closing in on COP26, which is being hosted in Scotland, climate change no longer belongs to a small group of policy professionals who meet under the auspices of the UN once a year. As my friend John from AGWA says, we are the climate community now, because we are all affected, and because the decisions we are making today are in fact decisions about climate change. We've stopped waiting for someone else to be convinced. We're owning our collective problem. In the US, we would call this the good fight, in the sense that we know the path is hard, but the direction is clear. Now, fight, unfortunately, implies useful actions look like protests or yelling at indifferent decision makers. For most of us, though, I would argue that the good fight looks like moving one budget line to another column, hiring new types of staff, focusing on data from the future instead of the past. All of the little decisions we make every day. As such, I want to talk to you all today about why action is so important and how individual action combined with radical collaboration can transform our world, and why I believe that is already happening in Sonderborg. But first, we have to talk about urgency. As I mentioned, we're running out of time. 4 years ago, I was fortunate to have been chosen as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on 1.5 degrees. It was released in 2018, and it made headlines around the world for its stark findings and its clear warning on the time left to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Now, just 3 years later after that report came out, the IPCC recently released a report from Working Group 1 of the AR6 cycle, with updated data that I believe we will hear more about later from Sebastian Murnil. In all the scenarios assessed, except for SSP 5 through 8.5, which is also known as the shared socioeconomic pathways, the central estimate of crossing the 1.5 degree threshold now lies in the early 2030s. To put this in perspective, this is about 10 years earlier than the midpoint of the likely range assessed in the 1.5 report that we did just 3 years ago. In other words, in 3 years, we have just lost 10, and the window is continuing to close. At the same time, we need to deal with urbanization. On average, urban land cover is expanding at twice the rate of urban population growth. Without deliberate policy interventions to curb urban sprawl, the unexpected increase in urban areas during the first 30 years of the 21st century will exceed that of all of human history, with consequent impacts on emissions. In addition to climate change and urbanization, we are also dealing with unprecedented uncertainty with regard to two additional global megatrends, being globalization and the fourth industrial revolution. Together, the scale, scope, and severity of these impacts will increase and put even more pressure on key infrastructure and society, both today and well into the future. But the good news is that we have a strong framework for what we need to do moving forward in the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. The outcomes that we need are clearly articulated in the SDGs with robust reporting mechanisms per country. But what needs to happen in order to deliver this? We need a shift in thinking of planning for outputs to planning for outcomes. The world is at a pivotal point. The time to act is now. In light of the recent IPCC report that I just referenced, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described it as a code red for humanity. But systemic change can be overwhelming. Where do we start? Well, interestingly enough, I think it brings us right back to Sonderborg and Project Zero. You see, 12 years ago, after that failed COP in Copenhagen, I began working on a project with former President Bill Clinton's foundation called the Climate Positive Development Program. And that initiative led me to Project Zero. Since 2009, I've had the good fortune to work with presidents, governors, mayors, billionaires, philanthropists, scientists, activists, and CEOs all over the world. I've traveled to over 100 countries, and I've visited over 1,000 cities. And during that time, I've personally seen the power of what individuals can do. But more importantly, I've seen up close the power of what happens when individuals collaborate. One of my favorite quotes is an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And you know what? During my travels, I often use Sonderborg and Project Zero as an example of what's possible when people decide to take collective action. But there's more good news. You are not alone. There is an awakening occurring around the world. For example, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, which was formed only 3 years ago, is now the biggest coalition of engineers in the world, influencing the work of 200,000 engineers in over 175 countries and over 10,000 cities, rapidly trying to bring capacity and infrastructure know-how to the problems at hand. Leaders from engineering companies have stood together and pledged to support the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And engineering associations are beginning to galvanize around sustainability, resilience, and decarbonization. As I mentioned before, we were talking about the non-state actors. The non-state actors have been galvanizing through the Climate COP champions, through efforts and initiatives such as the Race to Zero, which now has 6,200 members across 110 countries, including nearly 4,500 companies, 800 cities, 35 regions, 220 financial institutions, 730 educational institutions, and 45 healthcare institutions. This campaign now represents over 11% of the global population and close to 15% of the global economy. Just earlier this year in January, the Climate COP Champions team also recently launched the Race to Resilience with 24 partner initiatives made up of over 2,500 non-state actors, taking action in over 100 countries across the campaign's themes of urban, rural, and coastal resilience, with 15 breakthrough sectors that commit to at least 20% of their major companies by revenue that include clean power, concrete, and cement, aligning the sector-specific 2030 goals. However, while seeing all this collaboration and action around the world, it still requires local delivery. The ability to make decisions today that will influence our ability to thrive tomorrow in our own communities, or what I like to refer to as place-based coalitions. And that is exactly what Project Zero is all about. Project Zero, as we've heard earlier from some of the speakers, was launched in 2007 as a joint venture between people, politicians, and the businesses of the Sonderborg region. As my dear friend Peter likes to refer to it, it's the triple helix approach. Since its inception, it has involved more than 50 companies, created new on and offshore wind turbines, created roughly 500 new jobs, and implemented various education programs, all with the aim of reducing emissions by 75% by 2025. And that includes over 50 different projects. Now, this is inspiring stuff, but I know it can sometimes feel daunting that individual action isn't enough. I feel that way myself on many occasions. But just look at the example of Greta, one young schoolgirl taking a small action, in her case, silently sitting on the steps of her government demanding action, which has led to global change and impact. Look at these other familiar faces, that also took small actions to help change the world by inspiring people through similar simple acts. Just take Mother Teresa. That's the image on the far right if you didn't recognize her. She began her missionary work with the poor in 1948. She wrote in her diary that her first year was fraught with difficulty. With no income, she begged for food and supplies and experienced doubt, loneliness, and the temptation to return to the comfort of convent life during her first year. Now, I don't want to draw too close of an analogy to Peter and the rest of my friends at Project Zero and across Sonderborg, but I think you might be able to relate. But by 1997, the 13 initial members of the Calcutta congregation under Mother Teresa had grown to more than 4,000 sisters who managed orphanages, AIDS hospices, and charity centers worldwide, caring for refugees, the blind, the disabled, aged, alcoholics, the poor, and homeless victims of floods, epidemics, and famine. By 2007, the missionaries of charity numbered about 450 brothers and 5,000 sisters worldwide, operating 600 missions across 120 countries. In closing, the future we want is ours to determine. I want to share a great quote from the late American futurist Alvin Toffler, in which he said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." You see, we have this last chance to do this. And we know that if we don't do this in the coming decade, that in 10 years' time, we will have begun to lose control of the climactic system. And it will begin to matter less and less whether we do anything after that at all. And the impacts of that will be permanent on any time scale that has any meaning for humanity. In speaking about the future recently with a dear friend and how to sow stubborn optimism and hope about the future we want, he said something that touched me, and I want to share it with you now. You see, we have this very rare moment where we're living through a consequential moment in history, and we know we're living through it. Most consequential moments in history are only visible in the review mirror, and you look back afterwards and you hope that you showed up with courage and integrity and purpose, but you don't know until afterwards. Now we get to choose. We get to choose who we want to be in this consequential decade, and that comes from bringing all of ourselves to this transformation, all of our messy vulnerabilities, all of the human elements of it. And we cannot bluff our way through this any longer, so we need to show up. We need to decide that we're going to be part of the solution. We need to come at it with courage and determination, and we should have fun while we're doing it. We get to live through the greatest transformation in human history. You have the chance to play your part and ensure we come out on the right side of history. That's who we get to be, and we should celebrate that privilege every day. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and remember, you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start in order to become great. Thank you, Jane. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Seth. This was certainly a great start of the plenary talks. I understand that my sound was a bit bad before. I hope it's a bit better now. Otherwise, I'll have to dial 911 to call our IT department to come and help me. Okay, good. So thank you, Seth, for this very interesting and inspiring talk. It was a pleasure and great to have you with us all the way from New York. We have a few minutes to take questions. So yeah, please raise your hand through the button at the screen. And yeah, you can ask Seth any question you might have.
Seth, this is Kasper. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I can't hear Seth, by the way. You need to unmute.
Yes.
Hi. Good to see you. What a great presentation. You mentioned these celebrities that throughout history has made change. What do you recommend? Do you recommend a slow start based on partnerships, the long-term road, so to speak, or should we all do what we can? And does that really matter? Question mark.
Thanks, Kasper. Well, it certainly does. And I think that's the most important thing that is big and as complicated as some of these issues are. it will require action and participation from everybody in order to solve it. And I think for a long time, all of us, myself included, have been culpable of waiting for somebody else to do it or to solve the problem or to wait for government. And we simply run out of time. So for the first thing I would say is don't wait any longer, whether it's your local school, your board, your company, your house. Don't wait for somebody else. You need to start taking action now. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is it doesn't matter where you start. To the quote I shared at the end. The main thing is to start the process and to start learning by doing. I think that the last thing that I would say is we must shed the fear of failure. I think the rate of change that we're dealing with and how much action we need to take and the amount of time that we have to take, which is very short, absolutely ensures that we're going to make mistakes along the way. And I think the issue and the fear of failure has frozen action for a long time. I think we need to lean into failure. As I like to say, we need to fail forward. And from failing, we can learn how to iterate and how to leapfrog forward the past decisions. But if we rely on what we've done in the past, we're only going to ensure that we don't go fast enough, far enough.
Can I just follow up on that? Can you hear me?
Yes, but just shortly, Kasper.
Yeah, no, I'll do it short because Jan Mads Clausen in his introductory speech said that he is surprised that the producers of renewables and energy efficiency solutions doesn't have better results. Why don't they grow? Do you agree that that's an indicator of how slow things actually are going?
I do. There's also positive indicators that is beginning to change and the tide is turning, but there are some major invested interests that have held some of that back. There's also the issues that I just mentioned, which is fear and concern, change, and additional costs. And those are some broader issues that, individually we might not be able to tackle, but collectively we can. That's where the title of my lecture in terms of individual action and radical collaboration must happen, because without both of them, it won't happen fast enough. Just one quick example that I might mention. The first 10 years of my career, I was an engineer in a big engineering company. And it was a great experience. But what's fascinating about engineers, like many other industries, is that those companies rely on people. Their business, their liquidity is the staff and the intelligence they have in their staff. So they're very competitive with each other. And you want to attract talent, and the better staff you have, the better jobs that you get. Well, what's interesting though is if you look at the rate of action that is needed, and we talk about investing and shifting the trillions and what needs to happen. I did a little exercise with the Institute of Civil Engineers over the last year, and based on the rate of implementation that we need to decarbonize in the time frame required, it will be a 3-fold increase in the engineering work in the next 10 years. Now, if you look at the number of engineers that currently exist and that are graduating, what that means is that there are not physically enough engineers to design, build, and maintain the infrastructure we need in the next 10 years. So what the solution is that engineers need to radically collaborate. So instead of competing with the intellectual property of individuals, they need to realize there's more work than they can all individually do themselves. And we need to change the way the engineering community actually responds to and processes these large infrastructure projects, as an example of what I mean by radical collaboration, Kasper.
Thank you so much. Horst Günther, I believe you have a question as well.
Yeah, I try to make it also very short. Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you very much also for this very positive view. I think you talked a lot about a positive stimulation of changes. I'm a German, so we had this election, and this was, of course, a big topic, the climate change, and people were very strict before the election. After the election, you hear again that they are talking themselves out of the problematic. So my question would be, is it necessary actually to enforce? Is it necessary to give the people some restrictions which will hurt if you really want to change on the short time scale that also Jörn was mentioning? Or can we do the whole thing just by positive encouragement from your experience?
That's a great question. Well, it was interesting to see a couple of, a decade or so ago, what happened across Spain and Germany. You use Germany as an example, particularly with solar PV, and the incentives versus the carrot and the stick approaches, and how that turned out. I do believe that it will not purely happen by positive incentives, right? You can look at the examples of Tesla as perhaps something that went to scale and has happened very quickly. But without, I suppose, negative forcing policies or requirements, it will not give clear enough of a market signal. And that's part of what we need to do. So those things, I believe, have to happen in tandem. Another really interesting example that I might share is, if you asked me 8 years ago to dream up, a scenario to one of the biggest problems we have, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the last mile issue in transportation, right? So we have a lot of emissions from transportation that we need to remove. And the hardest thing in urban planning is how to get people off of public transportation and then right to where they need to. It's this last mile issue concept. So, if I had drawn up out of my pure imagination 8 years ago what a solution I would say we need lots of private sector and money. We need kind of a new kind of mechanism and technology, and we needed to kind of deploy it rapidly. Well, guess what? That actually happened. It was called micromobility. And what happened in the US, it was a complete disaster. It's exactly what we needed. Electric last mile solutions that are equitably used and easily diversified. And it didn't work. It didn't work because there wasn't a mechanism and policy in place to curtail how and where those were used. And there wasn't a systematic approach on how to deal with the marketplace who was rushing in to try to solve that solution and then cannibalizing itself. So you do need, I guess I use that example because you do need both approaches to do this.
Thank you so much, Seth, for your kind and eloquent answers. It was an amazing session, and I like the idea of being brave enough as a society to fail forward and to leapfrog. So now let's leapfrog into our next speaker. His name is Ralf Fröchtenicht. He's a physicist by education, and he's also a very good former colleague of Horst Günther Ruban. Ralf is a postdoc at Caltech in a group that has won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry back in 1999. And Ralf also holds some different top management positions at BMW with a direct report to the board of management. And his work has often been related to sustainability, like solar hydrogen for use in transportation. And today, Ralf is here to talk about sustainability in the supply chain. So Ralf, the scene is all yours, and we're looking forward to hear your talk.
Ine, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Warm welcome also from my side. I'm very pleased and honored to be invited to give a plenary talk today at this conference. Thank you very much. So I will try to share my presentation. Okay. And I would like to start with video. Let's see.
Sorry, Ralf, did you enable the sound?
Okay.
Maybe
I think the sound was missing, so
yeah.
I will try it again.
And also
okay.
enable the optimize for video feature.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So I will try it again. So.
This joy is electric. This joy is electric, and you're circuiting through. I'm so happy that I'm alive. Happy I'm alive at the same time as you, 'cause you've got a higher power. Got me singing every second, dancing every hour. Oh yeah, you got, yeah, you got higher. You've got, oh you got. My hands up shaking just to let you know now. You've got a higher power. You once in any lifetime. I'm going a million miles an hour. When far
video is worth million words. A video with our new fully electric vehicles, the BMW iX and the BMW i4. A video with important statements. There is no planet B, and it's all about the power of action. I'm very glad that I can present you today the BMW way towards sustainability. Premium by responsibility. Premium requires responsibility. We are increasing the pace to combat climate change. The BMW Group is committed to achieving the 1.5 degree target. A strong commitment to reduce significantly the CO2 emissions in the use phase as well across the whole life cycle of vehicle. And we strongly focus on circular economy from cradle to cradle, secondary first. The sustainability in the supply chain is a key factor here. But before stepping into the technique, into the product, I would like to talk about business, about corporate strategy, about corporate culture, about leadership. Business and sustainability cannot be separated. Sustainability has to be an integral part of the corporate strategy, of the corporate culture. We as BMW Group have put sustainability at the center of our company. It is also very important, the tone at the top. All major statements concerning sustainability are presented by Oliver Zipser, the BMW Group CEO. See, for example, the IAA Mobility 3 weeks ago. Sustainability has, of course, many dimensions. It's not only about environmental, it's also about social and governance. Of course, today I will focus on environmental, but I will talk about social and governance as well. And let's start with environmental. The BMW Group is committed to achieving the 1.5 degree target. We are the first German car maker since today to join the business ambition for 1.5 degree. And this also includes our commitment to achieving the climate neutrality along the value chain by 2050. Please let me start with our commitment for the reduction of CO2 emissions in the utilization phase in the life cycle of the vehicle. The use phase is the biggest contributor of our global CO2 footprint, accounting for more than 70%. Of course, it's a focus. By 2030, we will cut CO2 emissions from product use by at least 50%. And a steep ramp up of battery electric vehicles will reduce the CO2 footprint of the product use and will help us. But don't forget the CO2 emissions across the life cycle. That has to be considered as well. And here also our target is to have a reduction of about or at least 40%. The steep ramp up of fully electric vehicles. By end of this year, we will have produced more than 300,000 battery electric vehicles, 300,000. And over the next 10 years, there will be more than 10 million battery electric vehicles on the road. There are more than 50% of all BMW Group vehicles will be fully electric by 2030. With the Mini brand offering exclusively all electric vehicles from 2030. And I think this is a really strong commitment. We are doing our part. Commitment to the one, let me please summarize at that place our targets and our measures. Commitment to the 1.5 degree target, more than 10 million battery electric vehicles on the road. At least 50% reduction of CO2 in the use phase, at least 40% CO2 reduction across the life cycle of the vehicle. Moreover, we focus strongly on the principles of circular economy, from cradle to cradle and secondary first. And we will increase the share of secondary materials to more than 50%. Circular economy. Simply increasing the number of electric vehicles on the road does not automatically lead to climate-friendly mobility. It's crucial to reduce the use of primary material. The circular economy is the answer. Secondary first, use secondary materials wherever possible. will increase the share of up to 50%. Design for recycling, closing the loop. It's very, very important to design the vehicle so it can easily be dismantled and recycled. Focus on battery recycling. With the number of battery-powered vehicles growing, there is an increasing demand for many raw materials, such as cobalt and nickel, which are required for the vehicle's high-voltage batteries. Therefore, battery recycling has top priority. But can we really afford circular economy? Can we really, is it really possible to design a car for circular economy? And the answer is yes, it's possible. The BMW Group has set circular economy at the center of the IAA Mobility 2021 in Munich. We showed a visionary outlook on the potentials of circular economy and sustainable mobility. At the IAA Mobility, we presented the BMW iVision Circular, which you can see on that slide. A car with use of 100% recycled materials and with 100% recyclability. It's more than a vision car, it's a clear commitment. This car demonstrates that climate protection and individual mobility do not necessarily contradict each other. And moreover, it's a very interesting car. The efficient use of primary raw materials is crucial. Unfortunately, the extraction of raw materials often impacts habitats. Unfortunately, the processing of primary raw materials is often highly energy and highly CO2 intensive. Many raw materials, especially which you need for electromobility, are finite, so prices are rising, which you can see on the right-hand diagram. That means reducing the share of primary raw materials will make us environmentally more sustainable and commercially more viable. So business and sustainability are working together. Our approach is secondary first, which is an important step towards the circular economy. Look at the diagram, the CO2 equivalent emissions for the material production. The use of secondary materials releases far less CO2. For example, for aluminum, secondary rather than primary aluminum increases the savings by a factor of 4 to 6, and even with steel by a factor of 2 to 5. Partnership. Working with partners is a catalyst for the circular economy. We started collaborative projects on the circular use of materials with BASF and the Alba Group for the increased recycling of plastics used in cars. The aim is to reduce the use of primary plastics by a comprehensive recycling system and to check how a car-to-car reuse of the plastic is possible. Our vision is that in the future, a new door trim, for example, or other components could be manufactured from a used instrument panel, for example. Battery recycling has top priority, as I said. We are creating a green material cycle for battery cells. We have a technical proof of concept that cells are to more than 90% recyclable. It's possible. And even today, we use secondary material in our battery production, 30% recycled aluminum and up to 50% recycled nickel. We also agreed that all our cell suppliers run on 100% renewable energy today. But of course, we have also medium-term targets for the industrialized recycling. More than 70% for battery packs and more than 90% for cobalt, nickel, aluminum in 2030. Now I would like to switch from circular economy to the life cycle emissions of the vehicle. Starting with our own production, we are making our own production sustainable, lean and green. So we will reduce the CO2 emissions per car in the production by 40% by 2025, by 80% by 2030, by means of energy efficiency, green power and green heat. Switching to the supply chain. Unfortunately, the trend towards electromobility, the need of electromobility has a side effect. which puts a huge challenge at the supply chain. Look at the right-hand diagram on the top of the page, the CO2 footprint in the supply chain per car. If you would take no action, then the CO2 footprint would increase because of electrification by about 40% until 2030. And of course, that cannot be accepted. On contrary, our target is to have a reduction of 20% in the supply chain by 2030. That means the increase of 40% has to be overcompensated in order to get a net reduction of 20%. 40 up, 60 down. That's our target. And how can we face the challenge? How can we bring the battery electric vehicles from the dark side to the easy side? How can we reduce the CO2 emissions of a battery electric vehicle? And if you look at the diagram on the right side, you see the CO2 emissions by material of a battery electric vehicle. Battery cells, 26%, steel iron, 20%, light materials, 23%. That means all three together are about 70% of the overall CO2 emissions in the supply chain. It means, on the other hand, if you focus on battery cells, steel and light metal, these are the most effective levers for reducing CO2 emissions. Finding number one. Finding number two, CO2 emissions can be reduced through emission-free production using green power. Finding number three, replacing primary materials with recycled materials also leads to a significant reduction. Of course, it's circular economy. On the next slide, I will show you two realized examples how CO2 emissions can be reduced through emission-free production using green power. Left hand is our latest generation of high voltage storage, the 5th generation. Here, our suppliers use 100% renewable energy for the cell production, which leads to about 10 million tons CO2 equivalent savings by 2030. Right-hand side, we increased the use of solar energy for the raw aluminum to 100% for our aluminum foundry in Landshut, and we have also a saving of about 2.5 million tons CO2 equivalent tons. Before showing further examples, I would like to address the importance of close cooperation, of strong partnership with all the suppliers. Without our suppliers, we cannot reach our targets in supply chain. Partnership, that's the key. And for that, we are taking responsibility with our direct suppliers for implementing social and environmental standards in the supplier network. It is essential that our partners fulfill the same environmental and social standards we set for ourselves. However, as you can see, supplier network has a real complex structure. We work directly with about 5,000 suppliers in 70 countries, which provide our plants with 31 million parts each day. And we consider for specific raw materials like cobalt or lithium the whole supplier network. We are working for many years on the environmental and social standards to the supply chain. That was, with that, our experience over many years was possible to support German legislation for the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Because of our long experience, we won't stop here. We go one step further and engage in activities that go beyond our legal obligations. We are not talking about first-tier supplier, not only talking about first-tier supplier management, about end-tier risk supplier management. We are also promoting sustainability standards in key supply chains, and we are working on perceptible impacts at the raw material level. Please let me close my presentation with 3 success stories on environmental and social standards. As mentioned before, the steep increase of e-mobility will also increase the need for lithium and cobalt, which are important raw materials for the production of battery cells. These sources by ourselves critical raw materials like lithium and like cobalt directly from the producers and make them available to our battery cell suppliers. In this way, we take responsibility and create complete transparency over the origin and mining methods of the material. Otherwise, it won't work. Lithium. We get lithium from responsible mining in Argentina with sustainable water use, which minimize the impact on local ecosystems and communities. We also initiated with partners a study of sustainable lithium mining. Cobalt. In order to prevent the risk of child labor in cobalt mining, actually we do not purchase cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, leaving without any measures would impact strongly the local economy, and that's also not possible. That's not in accordance with social responsibility. Therefore, we, together with partners, had set up a Cobalt for Development project initiated to encourage responsible cell mining and small-scale mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in order to improve working and living conditions in surrounding communities. Natural rubber. The BMW Group is the first automotive manufacturer worldwide to equip its cars with tires using certified sustainable natural rubber and rayon, which is a wood-based material used to strengthen the tire. Contribution to preserve biodiversity in forests to counteract climate change. No premium without responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you for your interesting presentation on sustainability in the supply chain. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts about the design principles and how you work with the secondary first and closing the loop as your guiding design principles. And I don't know about you guys, but the BMW iVision Circular is certainly a car I would like to own myself. So great work, Ralph, and yeah.
Again,
So,
thank you very much for the kind
yeah,
work.
looks awesome.
Really nice. It's really nice to see how many ideas were going into that car, because if you not design the car to recycle and to design the car to use secondary material, it's not possible. And yeah, it's very interesting.
Thank you. We have time for a few short questions. We have 3 minutes to go before our short coffee break. So I think Mieke Ostra, you were first with your hand.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Mr. Frostini, for the presentation. Very interesting. And we love how BMW put down the benchmark for electric driving. So we want to thank BMW for doing that. But we see now other manufacturers are copying the concept, and also better. I don't know if you know the Autobahnkreuz Hilden. If you look there, you can see that BMW is the minority. So that's worrying us. So what my question would be: can BMW increase its pace of innovation? And the other question is, how are the ambitions of BMW in line with the targets of the EU for the 55% reduction of CO2 in 2030?
Thank you very much for your question and the kind words. Let me answer the second question first. Yes, it's in line, depending, of course, of the exact legislation. Probably we are even ahead of that because you have to consider which part is in the focus, which base year we are jumping from. So with our targets we have, depending a little bit on the exact formulation of the legislation, we will fulfill that requirement. So I think it's no problem for us to fulfill that, definitely. And the first question was around innovation, and for us, the customer is in the focus. The customer pays our innovation, pays our development, and therefore, for us, it's very important to convince our customer. It's not, unfortunately, not possible to force the customer, and so you need to design solutions which fits to the need of the customer, and that's our focus. And we are how to say, a rather small company compared to other companies, but our USP is innovation, research and development. Otherwise, it won't possible to survive in that business. And we have a strong competition over about many years.
Thank you for your answer, Ralph. And I can see that we have some more hands from Katarina Ruban and Horst Günther Ruban, and we also have a question from the audience with the Panda asking how competitors like Volkswagen are responding towards climate neutrality. But since we have a tight schedule and a few more exciting speakers coming up after the coffee break, I would like to save those questions until the end of the plenary talks, and then we'll have a lengthier Q&A. So we'll save those questions for later, but thank you so much, Ralph, for your interesting talk. And now we have a short coffee break or tea refill break, 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll begin again at the 10:30 sharp. So see you guys, everyone, in a few minutes. Okay, is everybody back at their computers? And are we ready to begin? Horst Günther and
Yes, sure.
yes, great, awesome. Okay, so great to be back, and let's continue these plenary talks with Christian Ibsen, CEO of Concito, as our next speaker. It's Denmark's green think tank. Christian has previously worked in the Danish Ministry for the Environment and the Danish Ministry for Climate and Energy, with a focus on the Danish and international climate agenda. And in the leading up to COP15 in Copenhagen, Christian was also responsible for coordinating Danish positions on the substantive elements of the climate agenda. And he's also been director of climate planning in the Danish municipality of Fredensborg, where his responsibilities included issues related to climate adaptation, urban development, and the implementation of a joint climate and energy vision for the greater Copenhagen area. So Christian, we're looking forward to hearing your plenary talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me, and I will now try to share my screen. It's always, please, Janne, tell me if it's coming on.
It's coming on. We can see all the slides on the side, and now we have the full screen mode, so it's perfect.
Okay, we go like this.
You're all clear.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me on your impressive conference. I just saw the program and I heard the previous speakers and inspired me a lot. Used to go to Sonderborg and meet many of you at those good conferences. My name is Christian Ibsen. Of course, I'm here just as the CEO of Concito. We are not a blue or red or any other political kind of think tank. We are a green think tank. We do not believe that being green is for one or the other side of any parliament. So I'm here to talk about mobilizing cities and national government for climate action. I know you have Sebastian later on the IPCC. I will not go too much into that, but I'm just going to touch, zooming in from the global to national to local government. And hopefully we'll be able to have some dialogue at the end. So I just need to start with this, because this is what has happened all over the place. Climate adaptation has many forms. Severe climate or weather-related disasters has many forms, and we only see some of them here in Europe. Many of these are droughts, fires, floods, and all that. We do not have to remind ourselves, but it is really bad at the moment. We also need to remind ourselves of this. This is what the Paris Agreement is all about. These scenarios going down the light blue and the deep blue trajectories is about 1.5 or 2 degrees. Where we need to go in 10 years time is about halving the global emissions as we are now. As you can see, the red lines are about what these NDCs, what the governments all over the country has promised to do. And even if they do that, we are aiming at 2.7 degrees. And we know implementation is hard everywhere. So we have a lot of things to do, and COP26 is coming up, and there might be some increase in ambitions. But just to tell you, we are not on the right track in terms of where we need to be. But this is the optimistic note. I've worked with climate change in 20 years. I've never seen anything like the political promises coming up. 80% of the global GDP is now under carbon neutral political ambitions. I've never thought I should see that. We see tremendous leadership from the EU, also from Biden, also from even China. If those are going to be implemented, we are looking into what might be the one opportunity we have in the next 4 years to turn things around. We saw some things coming out from China last week, and we might see some even more coal phase out things coming up. So let me now turn to the national level. On that little bit optimistic note, Denmark is of course one of the countries that has set out a goal that are quite ambitious. And we have a law in Denmark that talks about, as we always do, reduction targets within our own geography, 70% reduction. We have intermediate targets in 25. and a climate neutral in 2050. We all know we need to move that 2050 target forward to 2040, but let's come to that when we come to that politically. But what's interesting is that our climate law is actually also on a global dimension. Our climate law is on two legs. It's on national and international things, because us as Danes have the highest carbon footprint, fifth highest or seventh highest carbon footprint in the world. In terms of other resources, we are just as bad. So we are using a lot of stuff in Denmark, and we need to take action on whatever emissions or resources that we use, no matter whether it's inside Denmark or from other places. So consumption, emissions, carbon footprint, public procurement, green investment, other places, we can do a lot by transferring our technologies outside and so on. So we have to remind ourselves that our climate efforts in Denmark are much broader than it used to be. And that's very important going forward for a small country like Denmark that can do a big difference elsewhere. So this graph is very much in Danish context, but I just think it has some really important things to it. You can see the gray line there is what is going to happen if we just continue with the policy measures that we have. The orange line is if we're really going to implement the stuff that the government has put out so far, we can sort of follow the orange bit. And you can say, Tito then put in a line that said we might even want to implement fast from now on to 2030 to our 70% target. Maybe just do as much every year as we do the next year, instead of waiting with the hockey stick at the end. And what the main point is here, we still have a lot of things we haven't agreed upon. Half of the way to 70% is not agreed upon. But the other thing is waiting is, if we wait to do action at the end of the century, that comes to do with anything. There's some sound coming in from others.
Unmute everyone.
Yeah. Some has to unmute. Okay, I will continue. So it's all about not waiting too long. If we wait too long, you can see all the area below the orange stuff is 30 million tons of CO2. Denmark can save the atmosphere if we do it early. That goes with a municipality like Sonderborg, it goes for BMW, it goes for everyone. I don't need to go into those next steps, but in Denmark we have problems in achieving the 70%. We need to get a high CO2 tax in the center of the machine room on climate change. We haven't done anything on agriculture and so on. And just to be very precise, in Denmark, on your left you see the emissions today. In the middle you see the emissions expected in 2030, and you can see how far we need to go down in the orange box if we are to achieve 70%. But look at the big emission sectors is agriculture and transport. So all the easy bits are out in Denmark. We need to go into how people are moving around, how they eat, how we produce food. That's much more difficult in a country than if you do it on a power plant far away from consumers. So this is the problem in Denmark, that politically are very difficult, that you go now into sectors that mean something for people's everyday life. So let me now turn to the local level. As former head of a municipality in terms of planning and climate change, I think this is really what is impressive, what happens in Denmark at the local level. We don't have any strict laws in Denmark on what to demand from local level governments. So all is driven by political ambitions and by people out there like Peter in Sonderborg or anybody else that just means business and wants to do some difference out there. And that's really important that we acknowledge that things out there in the municipalities are actually driven by political ambitions by themselves. And municipalities are used to do core things like elderly, like schools and other stuff. But now, as you see, our election in local governments coming up in a month's time, climate change is all the way up there in the top, even though it's not a core thing for a municipality to do. But for people out there, it is a core thing for any municipalities to do. And I think that's a key message. It's coming down to local level now. I will go through it, but that's just this graph showing that what do you expect to do as a municipality? Going up, it's the degree of influence. What can you actually influence as a municipality? On your right, it's the potential for CO2 reductions. And as always, as a local government municipality, the CO2 emissions inside your organization, you can influence that, but it's not a really big potential for CO2 reduction. And as you move down, your authority. You can say yes or no to things. But when you go down to being a facilitator, your influence is quite weakened. It's more difficult, but you really have a high potential for CO2 reduction. Getting out there and facilitate emission reduction in your industries, with your citizens, and all that is really important. So you have to prioritize going down, even though it's much more difficult. It's more difficult to influence. Transport, it's all about electrifying. You heard the BMW, but you also need to go into small vans and even large heavy transport. It's all about how we transport electrified, and how we transport and the city logistics and so on. Just one short notice: electrify as much as possible. The fuels we're going to produce in the future, hydrogen or whatever, will need to be prioritized for ships and planes. Energy, we are phasing out coal. Oil and gas will need to decrease. In Denmark, we have a high dependency on biomass for burning. In our heat sector, has to go to a much lower level. Renewables just need to come in a much higher speed, and that's about electrifying as well, the heat pumps and so on, but also using geothermal and biogas for CCS and so on and so on. Energy efficiency is always the best energy. The energy efficiency is about how not to waste energy on things that we can do smarter and have better climate inside our schools and so on. So these are all key important stuff. Now agriculture is very difficult from a local level, because it is about producing food to the world market. To your right, you can see a sketch out of how we use our land in Denmark. As you can see, all the brown yellow stuff is about food production. And we just need to decrease the area we use for food in Denmark, but we at the same time need to increase the food we actually produce in total. So it's all about efficiency. It's all about producing more in less land. It's about transferring from too much animal production to more plant-based production and so on. And here you can actually, as a local government, partner in with local producers. You can do your local land use planning and so on that promotes that. So now carbon footprint. Yeah, I know everybody in Europe has a high carbon footprint. Denmark has a really high carbon footprint, and you're right, you can see the difference. It's in Danish, I'm sorry. We have 17 ton per day, and that's old figures we are actually recalculating at the moment. And the big things are kind of what the government can do, but you have food, which is mad og drikke, energy, and all the things we build, your clothes and so on, electronics. Those are all big stuff you can help and facilitate and give incentives to consumers. Even just facilitate the information on where you can, as a Dane, reduce our carbon footprint. When I'm at the dinner table with friends, I am not telling them what to do, but I'm informing them and inspiring them to where they can choose to reduce the carbon footprint. So start the talk out there everywhere you are, engage, inspire, and those things. We need to get the citizens on board, even just for the carbon footprint, but also for all the solutions that we're getting out there. Even the green transition will be seen by citizens. They will need to accept windmills, biogas plants, all the other stuff. It needs to be recognized that even the green transition will sometimes be ugly or sometimes be seen very clearly. So we need to get a high degree of mobilization amongst our consumers. So now a key thing, procurement. We just heard the BMW also talking about all the value chain. In Denmark, we are using a lot of money, 380 billion Danish kroner on public procurement a year, and we don't have any strict green demands on that. And how can that be? It's an enormous potential. 12 million tons of CO2 is from public procurement. That's all we need to do to get to 70% is on public procurement. And we don't dare to do enough because we say it's too expensive every time we buy stuff as a local government. So 6 million tons, half of it is from municipalities in Denmark. We need now clear climate targets and indicators for climate-friendly procurement, and that's very difficult in any organization. To do that, you have to go through your value chain. You have to, the climate heroes of the organization has to be the guy or the woman who procures, and that's a different ball game than being the climate workers in the municipality. And what we say is, come on, get the big emitting sectors out there first: construction, You have to demand zero emitting cement in 10 years time. Transport, you have to procure only things that are electrified when they transport. Food, you have to set a target of 30 to 50% reduction in terms of carbon footprint for your food in your canteen or whatever. And that could be other stuff. Very, very important that we now drive innovation in our value chain by setting clear targets on what we procure. I think I've talked enough, and I can see hands out there. Thank you for your attention, and please, any dialogue.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much for your talk. And yeah, let's dive straight into the questions. I think we have Mieke Ostrak coming up with a hand there. So Mieke, please ask your question.
Sorry, it was an old hand.
Oh, it was one of those dead hands. Let's see if we have any fresh ones. No worries. Katarina, you have a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this inspiring talk. And I see we have a lot to do on all levels. And you mentioned the influence of the users and that we should really take action. But in the end, I think it's the government that has to steer the transformation by investments. And how do we reach this?
Well, that's a good question. Yes, we do not have to have the discussion whether it's the government or the consumers. It has to be everyone. But I'm fully with you on the government has the ultimate responsibility. They have to set the target. They have to do the investments, both in terms of technologies and in research and development. But they also have to set up the framework for everybody to make the right choices in. In a consumer world, you have to have things that are black or CO2 emitting has to have a higher price. The things that are green has to have a lower price to get the consumers going. Otherwise, it will only be the consumer that are getting it, that are taking the right decision. So of course, we are completely lacking governmental setting the right framework. And sometimes I just feel like they should just get the framework right and then get out of the way. And many things can be done. But the problem is they're not setting the framework. For a local municipality in Denmark, they do not have the right framework to do all the things they need to do. For me as a consumer, I do not have the framework. It's too cheap to consume black stuff. I'm with you all the way.
Horst Günther, the word is yours.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. But in some way you indicated that there is not enough governmental steering. If we look at the research and development landscape, there's actually a lot of steering. Don't you think, for example, all the emissions we are in now, don't you think this will have also a positive effect, at least on the goals after 2030?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting question. I've changed my mind in the last 20 years on that. I used to have the things that research development really had to have free hands and stuff. But now I'm really much into those stuff that we have to, as a society, direct research to a certain degree, not all, but certain degree into the key pillars of what we know we need to achieve. And the main mission is one of them. In Denmark, actually, we also have this kind of mission-driven research development. I do think we need to have a focus on those key pillars of any green transition, being electrifying Denmark, being in the new fuels of tomorrow, being whatever. So I'm actually in favor of what you're saying, but we need to be careful that we not believe all the way in just developing something for after 2030. The problem is now the speed of implementation from now to 2030 is as important as research development and the other stuff.
Yes, but this is something I wanted to say in the very beginning. Now I say it now. I mean, if you look at the electrification or the electromobility, what happened over the last 1 or 2 years, also this talk from Ralf Röchtenich, there was a massive acceleration actually.
Yes.
And why was that possible? That was possible, of course, because there's a political will behind it, but it was also possible because there are lots of inventions that are simply there that are simply not implemented. And these inventions result from research and development activities over the last 10 years and more.
Yes.
So now we are going to cut all these basic research and development activities until 2030. We will have a serious problem because there's nothing we can just take out of the scope.
I agree. I agree. Research development is a key pillar of anything you need to achieve, because we actually, yeah, it's all about implementation from now on. To be very frank, we could have had the electrified transport revolution 10 years ago if the framework had been right. But now, of course, we are very impressed by the way it's coming in. But other stuff like capturing CO2 or even getting the fuels of planes and ships, that has to be accelerated in terms of research development and other issues. So of course we need to accelerate our research development, but it has to go on two legs. It's sometimes put us either research development in the long run or focusing on short-term implementation. There are so many things we could take down from our shelves behind us and just use and implement. And then we have to know that there's a limit to what we can achieve with those technologies of today. We have to do research much further in the technologies of tomorrow, or even not only on technologies, but also on behavior patterns and other stuff.
Thank you, Christian. We still have a few minutes for some more questions. If there is anything you would like to ask Christian. Okay. Well, thank you, Christian. It seems that you answered all questions already within your talk. Yeah, it was really inspiring. And as you said, the political ambitions and promises are better than ever. And there seems to be a will in society that was not there just 5 years ago. So hopefully we're all looking into a better and more sustainable future. Let's move on to the next speaker, who is joining us all the way from Australia. His name is Michael Goodside. Michael, please wave if you're here so that everybody can see you. Michael is a professor at the University of Adelaide, having moved there from SDU, where he was actually the first graduate in environmental engineering back in the year 2000. So Michael, it's great to have you back here at the SDU all the way from Australia. Michael leads an institute focused on modern energy systems, and he's also a member of the EUDP Board of Directors and on the board of the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy. Now, mining is a $9 billion Australian sector in Michael's state, and Michael chairs his university's Sustainability Strategy Steering Committee, and he has already said that he would be delighted to evolve greater collaboration between Denmark and Australia. So that sounds really good. As Ralf Früchtenichte stated in his talk before the break, we need more primary and secondary materials to go fully green, and this requires more materials. And this is something that is really difficult to do. And how do we increase profitable production of copper from low-grade deposits without increasing the environmental impact from mining or production? This is something that Michael will be touching upon now, speaking on the sustainable copper and material paradox. So Michael, please step on the scene, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, everybody. I will share my screen. I hope you can all hear me. And let me just get started. Great. Trying to share screen. There we go. So it's a pleasure to be here. And again, it's a beautiful, almost summer day in Australia. We're still dealing with COVID, so I'd love to have you all out, but unfortunately nobody's allowed into the country. Nobody's allowed in unless you have special permission. I understand from friends and family in Denmark, you're in a much better situation, but thoughts out to everybody in the world. I'm Michael Goodside, for those who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, and I've been really excited to get to speak today. In Australia, we recognize that we meet on the lands of the traditional owners of the land. In my case, it's the Kaurna people, and recognize their elders, past, present, and emerging. and would like to take the opportunity to recognize elders for other people meeting on traditional lands through this meeting. So I'm going to speak today about the sustainable copper and material paradox. And again, firstly, thank you, because as I think we've already heard with some of the talks, much of what will be discussed at this conference, I think we've heard is subject to a sustainability paradox. And some of these titles, these are just examples from the agenda where every single one of them, I think, is going to be challenged with meeting the materials, whether it's raw materials, plastics, any type of material that you need to move forward for an agenda you're actually trying to make more sustainable without worsening environmental impact. It's not a given. And I think it was very clear to see with the example that BMW gave, and it's not very straightforward with the latest talk. If policy could just fix it, maybe they would. So it's very complicated. And I think, though, that especially with research and the type of industry engagement and public engagement you see in Denmark in places like Sonderborg and places that I'm experiencing here, I think there's hope. So I'm going to talk you through what I think is the sustainability paradox and working with mining companies here on the paradox. I'm using a case for copper. And copper we have all around us. In your own house, there's probably somewhere between 90 kilograms to 180 kilograms of copper alone. And it's going to stay in that house as long as that house is standing, at least until somebody thinks of something better to do. So copper is essential for us to get to the green energy system or to modernize our energy system. And just as there are other commodities, and you can see in the graph, for example, copper is the commodity furthest to the left in the graph, with other commodities shown just how much kilograms per vehicle power generation. And this is a slide from a recent report from the International Energy Agency, so it's not from mining companies, just how much an increase in demand is in minerals is needed. So for society to meet its net zero goals, and if you even take society down to company level, for them to meet their net zero goals, they cannot presently be met without an increased impact on the environment and increased emissions. And this is meaning that companies themselves are trying to figure out how to meet commitments they've made to their shareholders with respect to their own environmental, social, and government commitments, and ultimately end up meeting demand but improving the environment. So I guess, we've all heard examples, and what we're finding out here is holistic innovation, greater efficiency, circular economy, and system thought is required. And it's a live discussion. For example, there's a major copper mining company in Australia who today, there's a report in one of the Australian Financial Review, one of our newspapers, that the shareholders are actually challenging their climate strategy. And so the impact is real. And to put it in perspective, until there is a replacement available for copper, a clean, sustainable future is simply contingent on copper. And double the current global production in the next 30 years is needed to meet the demand, to meet the scenarios to achieve net zero by 2050. To simplify that for you, that means that we have to produce and get to market more copper in the next 30 years, and that requires mining it, than has been mined to date in the history of humankind. That's a huge challenge. That requires more water, more electricity, more other types of energy sources. Now, exploration won't work. So in other words, you can't just go find another copper mine. because it takes 16 years to open up new mines. You can't substitute it with other metals. Certain items that use copper are being substituted with aluminium, but aluminium actually right now has a larger environmental footprint than copper. And you can't recycle for some of the reasons I've started out with, because the copper is tied up in long-term assets. Globally, maybe on average, you're recycling 10 to 12, maybe if you put focus on it, 13 to 15%, and that's it. So circular economy will become key. Copper is used in places we just simply take for granted. In Denmark, copper lines that go above ground, copper lines that go above ground, other places, the power lines require copper. They also require aluminium, steel, other commodities. But the demand for power lines alone, for the electrification needed to move to different power systems and distribute it based on projected human growth, doubles by 2040. We've talked about substitution and recycling. And here in Australia, what I'm finding, because the copper industry is so essential to this country, we're actually well placed to provide know-how and technology to help ensure a supply of sustainable copper into the future. But there's a lot of expertise we can learn from other countries, such as Denmark, in helping us reach that. And the countries from around the world where participants are calling in from. The IEA again, and the reason I'm showing this is because they're an independent energy agency. You might expect to hear this from a copper company or a critical minerals company, but the IEA is saying that data shows a looming mismatch between the world's strengthened climate ambitions and the availability of critical minerals. And how you define critical minerals is completely political. Copper is one of the critical minerals that are essential to realizing those ambitions. So if we look at how to get there, the supply gap versus demand. Copper mines that are operating right now are operating at full capacity, but on average, they're only getting to just the tip of the iceberg, even less than the tip of the iceberg. They're only getting to 5% of the known copper deposit. Now, this means that there's 95% in principle left, but it's difficult to get to. It's mixed with contaminants, such as arsenic, uranium, other contaminants. You have to grind it more to a finer size to get the contaminants out, which requires more energy. And in fact, in processing copper and other metals, it's this grinding that miners and the industry calls comminution that requires most energy right now. You have to go deeper. In my home state of Arizona, there's a copper mine. And to give you some relative idea of how deep these mines go, it takes 17 minutes from surface to the lowest sublevel on an elevator to get to the bottom of the mine. It's deep, and you have to go even deeper. Now, you could say, well, the price is rising, that's good. But as we've seen with so many other products, just raising the price isn't going to address the issue. So you don't get around the need that if you're going to get to more complex resources, or simply more resources, you're going to have to use more water, you'll generate a higher amount of waste, and you're going to generate higher emissions, both in scope 1 and scope 2. And you might try to mitigate that with your scope 3 emissions further down the value chain, but ultimately it's your responsibility to not pollute. The solution to pollution is not to dilute it down your value chain, it's to simply not emit or not pollute. And this provides a lot of challenge, but also a lot of opportunity for people to work together with the governments to resolve this. You see that one of the reasons copper is primarily sold in concentrates is because you have to process these contaminants out. And I think that as other areas, for example, the pharmaceutical industry moving to microfluidics and other efficiencies are known, then the knowledge can be transferred to other sectors that are using other types of processes and may not be applying the efficiencies generated in other sectors, both for chemical processing and energy efficiencies, to get to a cleaner copper or any type of commodity. So is it aspiration or reality? The copper price has not been this high since 2013, and it's growing and growing. All of the major copper producers have made public statements that they will reduce net emissions, many to net zero by 2050. They've all made statements they'll use less energy, less water, reduce waste and tailings. And their stakeholders and shareholders are asking them how. They're appropriately noting, I think, that the boards cannot simply watch prices rise and not meet ESG commitments. And so they're working on it, and they're working with other industry and with universities to try to address this paradox. Because as one of the CEOs has stated recently, society simply won't tolerate the way mining corporations, or for that sake, many other corporations operated before. Now, they weren't doing anything illegally. They were just operating best practice maybe 20 years ago when I was educated as an environmental engineer. And that best practice has changed because societal expectations have changed and the visions change. So we can ask ourselves, can we simply reduce demand for these materials by replacing the energy vector and store it with hydrogen? Well, we've worked on these types of analyses at my institute, and the paradox still applies. Getting to hydrogen is still very energy intensive, even with variable renewable energy sources that we have an abundance of in South Australia, such as solar and wind power. So what if we try to use fossil fuels? Well, that paradox still applies. If you have to use carbon capture and storage to capture the fossil fuel in some manner, you're using energy and resources to get there that are impacting your environment. And it's a complicated system. We have to decide where we want to go. And I think most countries, and I think there's even some movement with Australia federally now to commit to targets, spend the investment and effort on advancing the knowledge and innovation required to move to net zero. But we have to recognize this is going to take new materials or figuring out how to sustainably get to existing stocks. And we also have to figure out how to establish a circular economy. And some of the analysis we're doing at our institute is showing that, for example, with copper, what before was seen as perhaps not very attractive in a business model to recycle copper, there's a premium now coming to that 12 to 15%, 10 to 15% of copper you can recycle on the market that you can allow yourself to charge because your customers want it here and now, or want to see themselves as purchasing green, if you will, which in this case means recyclable copper. So apart from mining, what type of innovation could this look like? And I took some examples up I know other universities are working on. In this case, I know University College London, for example, is working on these two things, new materials like metal halide perovskites. And perovskites, I know Danish wastewater companies, one up in Herning was working on getting from wastewater. and printable organic inks that I know, for example, Sonderborg and the Max Clausens Institute is working on to make solar energy conversion more efficient, more flexible, and more deployable. So you're getting to the energy without using more materials necessarily, at least not in the cells. You're still going to have that double amount of use that you need in the grid itself. So in Europe and in Germany, there's a lot of investment going on in power to X. Well, here in South Australia, we're focusing more on something we're calling power to value. And that is, we want green hydrogen to be the goal. So hydrogen produced from variable renewable energy sources, and part of a system that generates value, and at the same time reducing demand on commodities such as copper. Now, not reducing demand on copper in an unthoughtful manner, but reducing demand through other energy vectors, which means that the state and its dependence on copper mining as a commodity and an important contributor to the state continues to be able to choose how best to use its copper and push the use of copper up the value chain rather than as a simple commodity dependent on market prices. We're working with other universities right now on research, asking ourselves if we can change the paradox by changing the demand side of the equation. And experts at our School of Architecture here believe that because the way we live and work has changed with COVID, perhaps there's opportunities there. We're looking at modeling ways to lower demand in a 1.2 million person city like Adelaide, which I think is about the same size as Copenhagen. How can we have people-friendly cities in a data-rich world, which was a concept originally in Europe, and translate that to other parts in the world and ask ourselves, do we need to travel? Are large office buildings really necessary? And with an international conference hosted in Sonderborg with people all around the world, you're proving, for example, you don't need to travel. It's nice to travel, but it would be interesting to query the conference dependents or delegates that if we all had traveled there, irrespective of if we were coming from Denmark or Adelaide, what would the CO2 footprint have been on the conference? And compare it with what it is when we're all dialing in and only using electricity we'd probably be using in any case. This past year, we were lucky to be awarded what's called a cooperative research center, which is a 10-year very large effort sponsored by the federal government, one of 3 awarded this past year, focused on heavy industry, low carbon transition for the industries that mean a lot for Australia: aluminium, iron and steel, and cement and lime. And we found that by lowering the carbon heat, we can minimize the CO2 while using the CO2 for other products, so valorizing it, and combine that with renewable energy. And for example, if you're using hydrogen, balance that with the water produced to get some better outputs. Now, there's a lot of theories in there. If we had the answers, it wouldn't be a 10-year research center. But we're doing it. We'd love to collaborate. And we're proud to be the home of this 200 million Australian dollar project over the next 10 years. My colleague and deputy director, Graham Nathan, is the research director for this effort. And we think, for example, with our Danish colleagues, with Aalborg, Portland Cement, et cetera, that there's some great opportunities to work together. All of these common challenges you see the HILT CRC addressing apply to the paradox. and the challenges that we're looking for solutions for. And a conference like yours that's learning about solutions from industry and other stakeholders is commended. Thank you. So I'd like to close out. Congratulations to the organizers. 21 years ago, I graduated as an environmental engineer from SDU. I've had a career that I can thank SDU for, and it's been such an honor and pleasure to come back as an alumnus and former colleague at SDU, to see SDU making such a global impact with your efforts. I think we all can and must learn from larger scale successful initiatives like Project Zero and Smart Energy Cities and the industries that back them. Sonderborg is a magnificent example of industry standing together with society and universities to generate impactful results that don't only improve the lives of people in Sonderborg, but improve the lives everywhere. And that requires vision and commitment from all the partners. And you've got it in spades, and I use Sonderborg all the time as an example of what other cities can do. South Australia, I'm proud to say, is now second only to Denmark with variable renewable energy penetration. I'm at a university where sustainability is a key focus of our leadership. Here at the University of Adelaide, we want to work with colleagues with similar values, and together we think we can and must address the paradox so that society will achieve net zero. And when we look for inspiration, we look to the calls that are being held today across with colleagues in these talks. And I'm confident that the challenge is great, but with the right team, we can meet it. So thank you all. And I'll look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you, Michael, for your talk all the way from Adelaide. It was really interesting, and we have a few minutes to take a question before our next speaker enters the stage. So if there is anyone who would like to ask Michael a question now, please feel free, and otherwise we'll take them after the final session. Horst Günther, you have a question?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Mike. That was very inspiring and motivating, actually. And I really hope that Australia opens up soon and we can come and visit you. That would be great. I was just wondering, you showed a lot of scenarios, and you showed the paradox, of course, which is really something one should think about. It's worrying me, actually. But there must be some growth scenario behind all these scenarios, some industrial growth scenario. The question is a little bit, are you assuming in all these scenarios that there's an global exponential industrial growth on the Earth, or what kind of models are behind? Because that's, of course, also something one could do, and you have indicated that also in your talk, that one simply is no longer placing on growth. One just takes, for example, the state of the art at the moment, or even go down, actually, in our expectations and wishes regarding growth.
Well, look, I think that's a really great observation. The modeling that we're using is coming from places like IEA and the IASA in Austria, and any government we talk to, or indeed any firm, says that they're committed to growth. So this just helps ensure that this paradox is there. Because if everybody's trying to grow, including our own families, if you talk about our personal lives, then you simply need more resources. So how do you get there without the trade-off on the environment? And you know, we've had exercises with our own students here trying to figure out if they say they're going to move from, let's say, a one-bedroom student dorm where they have a common and shared kitchen to their own apartment, what the impact that's on. Now that's a very natural move, but they actually find out that they were much more efficient when they were working and cooking together with respect to their carbon impact. Now, that's not saying we're all willing to do that, but I think there's ways that industry and the public can stand together to do things more efficiently and generate a circular economy. And somehow you have to reduce the impact of growth. And perhaps we as consumers and shareholders have to accept that some type of reasonable growth is an acceptable outcome, rather than everybody that we invest in grow.
Yeah,
So I think it's complicated, and that's why we need everybody
Yeah.
on board to reach this.
The problem,
Thank
of course,
you.
it's a global problem that is very difficult. And I have just, if I'm allowed, I just have a second short question, and that is about you brought this example with the solar cells, and we all know that silicon solar cells are not the way to go because they are far too dirty. When these perovskite solar cells came up, I can remember very well, we went to a conference and heard about that. Then I was thinking this is a really, really nasty technology, because it's dirty actually if you compare it to real organic solar cells. But now you brought the example that you actually take the stuff out of the wastewater. So you're cleaning the water and you get the bad stuff out and make something nice out of it. And I think what we probably need is, or the European Commission, for example, should realize that we need incentives, we need some positive support for these researchers which are working on these scenarios. And that's something that is still missing. If I look at the calls in this New Horizon Europe program, there's nothing about that. There's a lot about increasing the efficiency of solar cells. But the next step actually to look at this circular economy and look at additional functionalities or additional values, that is simply missing. That is just an observation.
Well, I think there's a lot of expertise, especially at SDU, on circular economy. Our modeling, our experts are showing that efficiencies alone will not get you there. You have to figure out how to valorize waste and turn it into something that can be used for another purpose. There are toxins, radioactive toxins, that when you mine copper or some other commodities are hard to get rid of. But when you think of that, some of these radioactive materials are used, for example, in radiotherapy for cancer patients, and are sold to hospitals at something like $36,000 a gram. Perhaps you could rethink about burying these toxins in the ground instead of synthesizing these treatments, which is what happens in medical physics departments around the world. And so all I'm saying is that right now, we optimize our companies and our value chains and our value streams based on a business model that returns the greatest amount of return to our investors. And if we start thinking about our investors as society at large, maybe we'll start breaking these barriers that allow us to have a circular economy. All of us are going to have to chip in. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for your talk all the way from Australia. There was certainly a lot to learn from you guys, and I also understand that in your state, single-use plastics are banned, so lots of inspiration that can be shared across the world. Now let's head straight into our last session here in these plenary talks. We have Sebastian Mernel coming up. Sebastian is a pro-rector and professor here at SDU, as well as a professor at the University of Bergen. And since 2010, Mernel has been an UN IPCC author, and he was actually one of the lead authors of the 6th major IPCC report, which was published in August, just a while ago. As you all know, human-induced climate change is affecting weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe, and scientists are also observing changes across the whole of the Earth's climate systems in the atmosphere, the oceans, ice flows, and on land. And many of these changes are unprecedented, and some of the shifts are in motion now, while some, such as continued sea level rise, are already irreversible for centuries to millennia ahead. But there is still time to limit climate change. strong reductions in emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases could quickly make air quality better. And in 20 to 30 years, global temperatures could actually stabilize. So that's the good news. The latest report, which was prepared by 234 scientists from 66 countries, highlights that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. So today, Sebastian is here to talk about the IPCC process and their assessment. So welcome, Sebastian Manner.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thank you for the invitation and for having me. And I would also like to thank all the previous speakers. It has been very interesting to listen to, and also thanks a lot to the persons who opened this conference. Let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
We see it. Yeah, it's in full screen mode now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hang on, I just need to minimize. Yeah, okay. Again, it has been a pleasure to listen to all these previous presentations about R&D innovation and how we move towards a more sustainable future. Because there's no doubt about that due to the changes we see in the climate system and due to the speed of change, we need to do something due to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. As just mentioned by Jane, I have been enrolled in the IPCC system for the last 2 assessment reports. And it has been interesting to be a part of that family, because it's a family where we discuss science heavily. It's a big community where we figure out how to structure, how to organize, what to bring into those reports, but also to figure out how can we present those data, those assessments in a proper way, because it's difficult even sometimes for us to understand how we should present it, because there's a key thing here that we need the society to understand how urgent it is to take these climate assessments and then bring them into play due to like a further development of our society. So IPCC, as you know, is the body under UN where we assess the latest science regarding climate change and impacts from a changing climate. And IPCC was established more than 30 years ago. And every 6 to 7 years, IPCC is publishing a new big, huge assessment report. Latest here, the 6th report, a few weeks ago. And the purpose is to give the society both a detailed and a broad understanding about the things we have seen due to a changing climate, but also what we are facing into the future due to how well we are able to develop our society towards more sustainability. I was a part of the first working group report, the one having a focus on the physical science, and the thing we presented in August was like a short summary for policymakers, highlighting all the main conclusions from that first working group report. It is a report having more than 3,000 pages, more than thousands assessments, but the most valuable ones were then placed in summary for policymakers and published, because what we wanted to do was to highlight the most urgent assessments and then bring them to the table, so head of states, politicians, they can react on those assessments. And the big report, this 6 assessment report, contains of like 4 huge documents. And another part of this report will be published in February and March next year, having the focus on adaptation and mitigation. And then later on in 2022, IPCC will summarize all the assessments or some of the key assessments from the 3 working groups, and then publish that in this synthesis report. Because what we need is not only a deep understanding about the climate science, but also how we can adapt our society and how we can mitigate our society towards reductions, but also due to zero net emissions in the future. So in between those big assessment reports coming every 6 to 7 years, there are sometimes a wish from the political environment, from UN, about getting knowledge about specific topics. And as we know, the Paris Agreement was signed in December 15. And during that meeting, our politicians had just a little clue about how the society would look like if we, when we move towards 1.5 or 2.0 degree target. So the scientific community was asked to provide the society with specific knowledge about how would the world look like in a like 1.5 and a 2.0 degree situation. And right now, the global mean surface air temperature has increased around 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial time, meaning that we have a very tight window before we hit the 1.5 degree and the 2.0 degree. So we were asked to provide specific knowledge about that, and we did that. An IPCC report, special report, was published in 2018, stating actually huge differences between those 2 levels of global mean temperatures. Huge differences in sea ice conditions, in sea level rise, in extreme weather conditions, and even in the biosphere. And then later on in 2018, another special report was published, the one about climate change on land, because there was a big wish again about getting a deeper scientific understanding about climate impact on food security, food supply, getting a deeper understanding about extreme weather and the impact on food supply, but also how the climate belts and zones are changing and what the impact on food supply is regarding that. And then further on in 18, late 18, early 19, another special report was published about the ocean and the cryosphere, because again there was a wish to get an understanding about how the polar regions, the high mountain regions, the ice caps, the permafrost, the sea ice, and so on, has changed and likely will change into the future, also regarding changes in global sea level rise. Because there was a wish to understand, also because what we see is that some of the biggest changes in temperature is occurring at high polar latitudes. So there was a wish to understand those changes, what is like the global impact when we face or when we look into a change in sea level rise. So bottom line is that in between those big reports, the 5th and the 6th assessment report, smaller specific reports has been published over the years. So being a part of IPCC, as I mentioned, is being a part of a big family. For the last 3.5 years, we were selected to be a part of IPCC, and that meant that more than 230 authors, participated in this work from more than 65 countries, mostly men, unfortunately. And then the good thing by IPCC is also that they try to enroll new scientists into the system, so they can gain both knowledge about IPCC, but also knowledge about the UN system and how it works. Our report is based, the 6th report here, the first working group report, is based on publications from more than 14,000 studies, and it is published studies all the assessments we did in IPCC is purely based on already published publications. In IPCC, we are not conducting research ourselves, but we rely on the research being done among all these climate groups worldwide, but also among groups working with model development and so on. And when we work as a scientist, we submit our work, it's criticized by other scientists, and that was also done for this IPCC report. And overall, we received around 80,000 review comments, which we had to address properly and in a very transparent way, so everybody could see what we wrote and how we changed the chapter from like one step and to another. So it's a quite open process, and everybody can dig into that and see how this report actually was shaped. And being again a part of IPCC is also being a part of an international family. Altogether, this report contained 13 different working groups, ended up in 13 chapters. And this is just to highlight that working in this international environment is sometimes challenging because we had meetings around the clock. We collaborated and worked together with persons from many different countries and cultures. That's both inspiring, but they can also sometimes be challenging, I would say. So overall, this report was published in August in Paris. It was an international press release. And then here in Denmark, we had like a national release where the persons in Denmark being enrolled in the IPCC report presented key elements and key assessments together with the Minister for Climate, Environment and Utilities, Dan Jørgensen. And the reason for him to be here and the reason for us to ask him to join this meeting was that we want to make sure that he really got a deep understanding about these assessments. Because one thing is that we do and we work towards 70% reduction in our emissions in Denmark towards 2030. But it's even more important that that our ministers, head of states, they understand these challenges we are facing, so they can take likely the Danish agenda and then put it into an international perspective. Because there's no doubt about that research and development and innovation can play an even bigger role internationally compared to our tiny climate. Because what we learned from the IPCC based on the assessment is that every ton of CO2 we emit matters in the climate system. And just to bring some perspectives into our assessment is that when we look at the global mean surface temperature change, at least in a perspective going back 22,000 years, we can see in this red circle that since pre-industrial time and onwards, we have seen a global mean temperature change of around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees happening over around 100 years, so to say. And this is quite fast. And as I mentioned earlier, is that we need to look into like the speed of change, because when we look back in time, we can see another fast period where the temperature changed 1 degree, but not over 100 years, 140 years, but over more than 1,000 years. So what I'm saying here is that things today, due to a change in the global mean temperature, is running up to 10 times faster compared to what we have seen earlier when we look into a climate system being forced by natural variabilities and not by anthropogenic variabilities. And just having a zoom into the last 140 years, this curve indicates how the global mean temperature has changed due to like both natural variabilities, but also due to an increase in greenhouse concentration over time. And as you can see, the temperature goes a bit up and down, but overall, we go towards higher temperatures. The last 5 years, in perspective to 1880, has been the 5 warmest years we have measured globally on our planet. But also within the last 10 years, the coldest years within the last 10 years is warmer compared to the warmest years in the first 10 years of our time series. But also another thing I just want to highlight here, let me, for example, illustrate 3 boxes. And what we can see in the first box, which spans the period from 1880 and to 1930, is that the temperature went a bit up and down. We had some extreme years, so to say, year 1900 was extreme warm in that time period. But we should not go many decades ahead in time before we saw what was the extreme actually became like normal conditions, became average conditions. And the same for the period 1950 to 1970, that those years which were like the extreme years a few decades after simply became like normal conditions, and so on and so on. And what I want to highlight here is that when we look into like a changing climate, we normally go from something being the extreme to become like the average or the mean conditions. So the question is, now we are facing some of the warmest years within the last 5 years. So the question is, the extremes we see close to 1.2 above pre-industrial, when will they become like the average climate conditions or the average temperature conditions on the globe? It's a good question, and we simply don't know. But what we know due to our models, due to our understanding of the climate system, is that, but also due to some of our assessments in the latest IPCC report, is that 1.5 degrees will likely be reached already in the early 2030s. And this is, as also mentioned by another speaker today, this is around 10 years before what was published in this 1.5 degree report some years ago. So the 1.5 degree is coming closer and closer. And one thing is that we talk about a global mean temperature, and this is more like a political tool, because what we are hit by when we talk about changes in the climate system, it's more like the regional climate, and the regional climate can be very different compared to those mean changes we are talking about. But what we see now when we discuss and when we highlight the assessment from the latest report is that there's no doubt about, it's unequivocal, that human influence has warmed the atmosphere over the last many decades. And we know when we dig into our data set, we can see that the global mean temperature has increased 1.09 degrees since pre-industrial and towards the last decade. And based on those 1.9, our models, they can explain, and they can explain that a temperature increase by 1.7 degree can be explained by human impact, meaning that natural variabilities within the last 140 years only causes a little change in the global mean temperature. And the big reason for that change is due to human influence. We also know when we dig into our climate studies, into the literature, that the global temperature has increased faster since 1970 compared to at least back over the last 2,000 years. We also know, and one of the assessments we also launched is that hot extremes, they have been more frequent now and more intense, not only for Denmark, so to say, but also globally speaking. And we also see that the amount of cold extremes has become less frequent. So we see a big change in the climate system, also due to like extreme events, and not only warm extremes and cold extremes, also due to like heavy rain events, due to storms and drought, and so on and so on. But what we also stated in the report is that it's unlikely that these events would have occurred without human influence. So again, it's important to remember that the human influence is quite severe when we talk about our changing climate system, but also the speed of changes. When we look into like regional climate, and I just touched base a bit about that, we see huge variabilities in the climate system, but also in the temperature conditions. And this is a figure from the NASA data set also being used in our latest assessment report. It's obvious due to this figure that the regions where we see like the fastest change in temperature is at high latitudes in the Arctic area, but also at lower latitudes close to Western and Arctic. And Denmark is quite on the edge. It's right on the edge where we have seen an increase of 1.5 degrees since pre-industrial. The Danish temperature on average has increased 1.4 degrees Celsius since 1880. So Denmark is right on the edge where we see 1.5 degrees. And the reason for that is that we see, especially in the Arctic area, having an influence on the Danish climate, but also at lower latitudes, we see some feedback mechanisms who is speeding up the temperature conditions, especially in the Arctic, but also especially on Antarctica and in high mountain regions. So what should we be concerned about here? We should of course be concerned about that the fastest changes we have seen in temperature is happening in the Arctic and Antarctic, because in Arctic we have huge amount of ice being based on land, and that means that when the ice is melting, when it is reducing both in area and volume, the land ice will contribute to the global sea level rise. So now we are putting pressure on the land ice sources for a changing sea level into the future. And we know that over the years, since at least 1980 to 1990, both the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet has changed in mass towards higher loss rates. We published 2 papers in Nature a few years ago, specifically looking into the Greenland ice sheet, but also specifically looking into the Antarctic ice sheet. And what we can see today is that the loss rate is 3 times higher compared to in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And we also know that when these big ice sheets, they're being forced by a changing climate, it's very difficult to stop those loss rates. So we would expect, even though that we now would be able to stop this increase in global mean surface temperature, likely towards 3.3 to 5.7 in 2100. If we are not able to stop this, and if we are able to stop this, then the ice caps will still contribute over time to an increasing sea level rise, simply because we have started different kind of processes, dynamic processes in those 2 ice caps, meaning that it's very, very difficult to stop the ice contribution from those 2 guys and their contribution into the global sea level change. We know that around this curve is illustrating the area of the globe being hit already by 1.5 degree, or this is the red line, or by 2.0 degree, this is the blue line. And what we can see here is that over time, the area being hit by 1.5 has increased a lot. So nowadays, around 25 to 20% of the global area has already been hit by 1.5. What is most concerning, I think, is like, again, the speed of change. It's the change from like the 60s and onwards, indicating that in the decades to come, a bigger area of the globe will be hit by 1.5 degrees, and we will see even more severe and even more extreme conditions compared to what we have seen today. When we dig into precipitation, which is another core atmospheric parameter, we see that precipitation on average has increased since 1950. And specifically for Denmark, we know that the mean annual precipitation for Denmark has increased around 110 millimeters per year since 1880 and to present day conditions. We also see that, at least for Denmark and other places globally, that the precipitation is uneven distributed. So we have now a higher frequency of extreme events, but we also see a higher intensity of precipitation events. And just a few examples can be related to the extreme rain weather Europe saw this summer, but which we also saw other places also here in Denmark. So this trend here in Northern Europe, but there's also a trend, globally speaking, that we go towards more precipitation and an uneven distribution of precipitation. We also know from our work in IPCC that the global retreat of glaciers has been increasing over the last decades, but also that, again, that the contribution from land ice is now contributing more to the global sea level rise compared to earlier. And just to mention a few numbers, since 1900 and onwards, the global mean sea level rise has increased around 20 centimeters on average. And here we need to remember that when we talk about sea level changes, we also look into huge regional variabilities in sea level. And some examples is that if we look at Indonesia, for instance, we have seen much faster changes in sea level rise compared to other places. And if we look into like the western part of the US, the state of California, Oregon, and Washington, we have seen less sea level rise compared to these mean values. But overall, we have seen over time a higher sea level rise per year, and for the last decade, so to say, it has been close to 4 millimeters per year on average, globally speaking. When we talk about sea level, there's a huge uncertainties because what we are struggling a bit about in the scientific community is to get like a very deep and scientific and physical understanding about the climate impact on the big ice sheets. And this is a picture from Western Greenland, from Jakobshavn, but also to get a big and more specific understanding about how a warmer ocean is melting the ice from beneath. So if we want to reduce our uncertainties into the future, when we talk about sea level rise, we need to become even more specific and even more scientifically clever on the physical processes in this interface between a warming atmosphere, a change in ice dynamics, and warming ocean water melting the ice sheet from beneath. But overall and globally speaking, there's no doubt about that we will reach 1.5 and 2.0 degree during this century. It's just a matter of time, a question about how fast are we going to develop our society towards more sustainability. And here are lowest mentioning like 3 different scenarios. So if we are able to reduce our emissions and go towards a very, very sustainable society, then we can expect the temperature in 2100 to be 1 to 1.8 degree above pre-industrial conditions. But this is only if we go really, really hard into this development of our society towards a sustainable future. If we are not, and we take the most extreme case, then we can expect our globe to be 3.3 to 5.7 degree warmer due to pre-industrial conditions. And please remember that this is global mean values. Then we will see regional values and regional changes, which can be even higher compared to the numbers I stated here, or IPCC stated here. So again, it's about how we develop our society, and this is a figure from the report stating that if we follow the most optimistic scenario, the SSP 1.9, then in worst case in 2050, we could see a global mean temperature on around 2.0 degree. In worst case, if we are not able to develop our society towards more sustainability, then we are following the SSP 8.5 scenarios, and then we could, in the worst case, face a globe which is around 3 degrees warmer on average compared to the pre-industrial conditions. And this is not in 2100, this is already in 2050, and that means around 30 years from now. So overall, we in the report highlighted these different kind of scenarios, both due to global temperature change towards 2100. We looked into like Arctic sea ice conditions and so on and so on. I don't want to dig more into these, but just emphasize that how we develop our society into the future is very important due to how the globe, how the temperatures, how the climate will respond due to increasing emissions into the future. So bottom line is, and my final slide is that if you're more interested in working with or playing with these different kind of data sets we used in our IPCC work, you can go to this homepage, because in our IPCC work, we also developed this online tool, this web-based interactive atlas, where you can go to different kind of regions on the planet. You can select one or two or many more. You can look at different time series, different kind of data sets, different kind of parameters, variables due to temperature, precipitation, sea level change, sea ice conditions, drought, heat extremes, extreme precipitation events, and so on and so on. So that can give you like a more deep understanding regarding or about some of our assessments. And this is, as we see at IPCC, this is a good way to reach the public, because not many read these heavy reports, but this is a way to make all our assessments and make the data set more available for the global community, so to say. So I think I'm done here. So thank you for your time, and in case you have questions, I will be happy to address those.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for your talk on the IPCC process and your findings. It's been a great morning with the plenary talks. Does any of you have a few questions? We've had Seth talk about giving us a great start about how individual action can transform our world if we combine it with radical collaboration. We heard Ralph talk about sustainability in the supply chain, Christian talking on mobilizing cities and national governments for climate actions. We had Michael joining us from Adelaide with his talk on sustainable copper and material paradoxes. And finally, Sebastian. So if you have questions for either of these speakers, now is the time to raise your hand. And I would also like to urge all of you to just turn on your video so we can see each other's faces before the lunch break. So invitations for questions is open, and I'm sure the speakers are ready to take your questions. So now is the time to ask them. Katharina?
Already my turn, thank you. I have a question just to Sebastian. As you toured around and you talked to so many politicians, how did they actually perceive this message? How did they react?
I think when I talk to our Danish ministers and to international politicians, they're fully aware about these conditions. They're fully aware about the assessments from IPCC we did. So that is obviously one thing. The next step is to put this into action, right? And due to all the talks we had this morning, it's not an easy task to do. But from my point of view, they are fully aware about how that climate has changed over the years, but also what we expect to see if we're not doing anything due to reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere.
Thank you, Sebastian. Horst Günther, you have a question?
Yes, after this talk from Sebastian, it's very difficult to ask questions about some specific small things, but I will do it anyway, because I had a question before and to Ralph. And I was actually very impressed also by Jonas Clausen's talk about what Danfoss is doing, what industry is doing in order to become more sustainable, what responsibility industry is taking over. And I was also impressed by what BMW is doing and thinking about to do. My little problem with BMW is, as you also said, Ralph, in the end, it's in the premium segment. So these cars are extremely expensive, and not everybody on this globe can afford to drive a BMW. Many people are driving other kind of cars, smaller cars. And so my question would be, is there an agreement? Are the car makers working together with this good practice that they are doing in order to become more sustainable? So in other words, are the lessons learned from BMW, can they be used by Volkswagen or by other small car maker companies, or Toyota, that have that are maybe more in the affordable segment?
Thank you very much, Gunther. Of course, it's possible to take over some best practice examples, and we have also the mini brand, small cars, of course, also in the premium segment. I think it's only possible if we put all other efforts together, because, for example, implementing circular economy, recycling, and so on, it won't work. It's only focused on one company. So therefore, we would be quite happy. And I think there are good examples of taking over our approach. But for example, concerning circular economy in the car manufacturing, I think it's BMW who started on that. So I can invite everybody to join our race because it would help if we work together. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. And also, if you look about the whole vehicle life cycle, people won't buy fully electric cars if there is no charging infrastructure. And that's also a key. We won't get 50% electric vehicles in 2030 if there is no charging infrastructure. So many countries are on the good way. Some countries have some room for improvement. And I think this is very, very important. I talked about partnership and working together, and that's really the key.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you so much for your answer. What about the other speakers? Do you have questions to each other after hearing each other's talks? Any thoughts you would like to share? You each had the different perspectives coming from organizations and industry from very different parts of the world. Is there anything you would like to share? Or any other questions? We have Christian here with a question. Christian, you may speak now.
Yeah, I'm very, very curious about this electrifying the transport sector, and maybe Ralph, just on the BMW case being an example. I'm at all sectors afraid of delaying implementation of the real solutions. And in terms of personal, in terms of transport, I'm all for full electrification instead of hybrid. So trying to get to full electrification instead of spending too much time on hybrid, even though it's a part of the automobile today. How fast are you moving to full electrification and beyond hybrid?
Christian, thank you very much for the question. On a global perspective, it's difficult to answer. So you see different countries react completely different. So for example, in China, hybrids are of no interest. In Europe, it's different. The States are different. So I think we have to bridge the time from today to the future. And the 50% I mentioned are for fully electric vehicles, for battery electric vehicles, not about hybrids. But also hybrids help us in order to reduce the cost, to have economy of scale, because you have the same electric engines in that hybrids. And so I think it's, a bridge time coming from today to the future. And I think this is also quite important because it's extremely difficult to predict how the customer will react, how our infrastructure will build up. And if you have the alternative to have no electrification or a hybrid because the charging infrastructure won't work good enough, then for me, it's a valid way. And that's our solution. So we are technically open. Our architecture, which lasts for about 20 years or more, are prepared for every technology, including hydrogen. And of course, with the good offer for the customer, we will put a lot of effort to make an attractive offer for the customer. That's our way. Otherwise, it's quite difficult. It's, as I said, it's impossible to force the customer. Completely impossible.
Thank you, Ralph. And thank all of you for a great morning with very interesting talks from all around the world, despite time differences. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us. I'm sure we could go on for hours with several more interesting questions, but I know there's a lunch break coming up. So I would just like to say thank you to all of you for joining us. And now I know Frederik Gottlieb has some practical information for all of us before we head to our lunch breaks.
Yes, thank you, Jane. Just a short info. So now we will have a lunch break until 1 o'clock. And after the lunch break in the afternoon sessions, you will have the opportunity to choose between different tracks. So just short information about the different tracks and how to do it. So if you would like to follow the track about research in new materials and new solutions, you should follow track A. And if you want to look into cities and infrastructure, you should follow track B. It will be possible for you to switch between the two different tracks during the afternoon, and you will choose track using the breakout room feature in Zoom. So when you come back, there will be an option available in Zoom where you can click breakout rooms, and then you can choose either track A or track B. So track A will be about photovoltaic smart green materials and energy efficiency, and track B will be about smart cities and city networks. So lunch break is until 1 o'clock, and please remember to sign back in time, or you can also just leave your computer on to stay in the meeting. Thanks.